Okay, in this video we're going to continue talking about JavaScript arrays, specifically the .filter method on arrays. The filter method allows you to create a new array based on an original array, holding only the items from the original array that you want. And you can choose which items based on a custom function, a test function that allows you to see if that item should be added to your new array or not. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Here we have our old style fruits array, right? And then we concatenated. We learned what concat does. This is basically just going to join these two arrays together, but then you can also concat with individual items, right? So this should be the final array here, should be an array of 8 items, and then we're storing that back into our original variable fruits, okay? And then we're just going to log that out real quick. So up here we can run node and then array filter. Okay, so we have 8 elements in here. Now say we want to filter out and only store in our new array berries, the things that have berry in the name. So these are our berries. And we can do this using array.filter. So this is going to be fruits is our array dot filter. Okay. Now this function or this method takes another function. This function is a test method, and more often than not it's defined in line like this. So really I'm just passing in a function here, but you'll see this syntax all the time in JavaScript where that first argument is a function. Okay, so this is no different than if I defined a function up here, function foo, right? And then instead of this syntax, I passed in foo, right? Either way, I'm defining a function and passing it in, right? If I do it this second way, which you'll see all the time in JavaScript, it's just I'm defining the function as I'm calling this other method. Okay, and this is useful because more often than not you'll only use this type of function once, so you don't really need to have a name associated with it. You just pass it in to the filter method, for example. All right. So what is the purpose of this function? Well, this function is a test function. It's going to test whether the item in our original fruits array is worthy of joining our output array. Okay, so basically the way this filter method works is it iterates over every single item in our fruits array, and it calls this test function, and this we'll call it item. It calls this test function, passing in each item there to the function. Okay, and so what we define in this function is if we return true, then that makes the cut. That item then is added to our list. Okay, so in this case, we would want to check to see if the term fruits, or we're looking for berries, right? We want to check to see if berries is in one of the elements, right? So what we can say, so if item.index of, we want to look for berries, does not equal -1, then we'll return true. Otherwise, return false. Okay, so now we've got some issues here. My linter doesn't like a couple things, and we'll examine what those are here in a second. But in the meantime, I want to just print out berries here. So I'll console.log berries. All right, and we'll see if this worked. And so if you remember index of, this works on strings as well as arrays. So the item is the individual item in the array. Okay, so the filter method iterates over every item in the array, checking to see if berries, if it can find that in the item. So if it does not equal -1, then that means it did find the index of that item. So here it would have found berries at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the index number here would be 5, which is not equal to -1, which means it did find berries in that element. So if it found berries in that element, we return true. Otherwise, we return false. Okay. So if you look at my linter here, it says unnecessary else after a return. Okay. And I have this configured to be the behavior. What does this mean? Well, if we ever enter this code block, it's going to return true. If we don't, then we're going to return false. So we don't really need this else at all. It's just, it clutters up our code. We can just have return false here instead of the else because we're returning. We don't need to have an else block because it's just returning. So if we go in here, we return true. If we don't, then it's return false. And that's their equivalent, right? But this looks cleaner. There's less clutter, right? So that's a visual thing. So that's why my linter was complaining there. All right. So remember, index of searches an array or a string for the item, and it returns the index if that item is found. If the item is not found, it returns -1. So if item.index does not equal -1, return true. Now one thing here, this is also unnecessarily cluttered. Right? Item.index of berries does not equal -1. That's either going to be true or false. So if this statement is true, we're returning true. But if this statement is false, we're returning false. So why not just return this statement? So this is going to be either true or false. And see, now this is much cleaner. Okay, so that was just a quick example into certain time. There's lots of different ways to code things, and there are equivalencies. But you want to try to always make your code the most readable, right? And in this case, this is just one line of code as opposed to having 5 unnecessary lines, right? So this is much more readable than some of the other versions we went over. All right, so that's the idea of filter. We can search for different items, and it's returning a separate list. And we saw that it worked. Any of the items if they had berries in it, right? What if we also wanted to include items that had fruits in it? Okay, so if item.index for berries does not equal -1, so that means if it found this, or item.index of, and we're searching for fruit, does not equal -1. Okay, now this is Boolean logic. It gets a little tricky sometimes. So we have to think, is OR the correct operation here? So let's say we were looking at dragon fruit, right? Item.index of berries in dragon fruit. It won't find it, so this will be a -1 because item is dragon fruit. -1 does not equal -1. That's false, right? Or dragon fruit index of fruit does not equal -1. So it will find fruit, and so this will be true, right? So we're looking for something that either has berries in it or fruit in it. So these Boolean expressions can be tricky sometimes, right? And so here we see that it did work. Only things with berries or fruit in the name show up. Okay, so remember, this is the OR operator for a Boolean expression. What's on the left is a Boolean expression, And Boolean expressions always evaluate to either true or false. So the item on the left and the item on the right are both Boolean expressions. With an OR operator, the entire expression is true if at least one of them is true. So if one or the other is true, and that's why we call it an OR statement, if one or the other is true. Okay, so what we're going to try to do now is write our own filter method that behaves this way, that takes a function. Now again, remember, this filter method is really only taking in one parameter, and it's this function that we made. Right? So this is the same as saying function test item. Right? And then this is my function. So this is the test we are using to see if we want to keep the item. This is the filtration test. Right? So I can put test in here. So this is all we're doing. It's the exact same thing, except the other version we were defining the function inside here. And you see it works just the same. All right. So because we're going to use this function a second time in our other version, we're going to create a filter array method. I'm going to keep this as a separate function and just pass it in. All right. So here's our new function. We're mimicking this filter method, right? So we're going to say function. You first need the array. So the filter method doesn't need you to pass in the array because it has it at the beginning. Filter dot, right? And we'll go into a little bit more about that once we get into objects more. But in our method, as far as we know, we don't have access to anything external. We need everything to be passed in. So we have to have access to an array, right? And in the filter method, right, that's that array, fruits. So we're going to pass that in, and then we have our test function. Right? We have some test function. And so what we want to do is iterate over all of the elements of our array. So we're going to have a for loop. And there's a number of different ways we could do this, right? We could say array.forEach. Or we could do a for loop, a classic for loop, right? Let I equal 0 while I is less than array dot length I plus plus. And so I is going to be the index for each one of these items. Right? So this is a real common thing that you'll see. Start I at 0 as long as I is less than the length, not less than or equal to, less than the length. Because if I was equal to the length, that would be an invalid index. The highest index is always one less than the length. Right? So I equals 0, I is less than array.length. And what we want to do is for each one of these elements, we want to run the test function. So first we have to get the item, right? So let item equal the array item at index I. Right? So this is reference by index, and we're passing in I. So that gives us the actual item of the array. And then we want to run the test function. Right? So we want to pass in test. We'll call the test function, right? Because remember, this is a function, so we can call it. And we want to pass in our item. Okay? But this test function should either return true or false. So if it returns true, then we want to add these items to our list. If it returns false, then we don't. Okay? So we need to do more here. So let's put a little pin in this here. Do something else. So remember, the point of this whole function is to return another list, right? So we have to first define a list. So we'll call this our results list. And it's just going to be an empty array. And as we iterate over the array that's supplied, we want to check to see if this is true. right? So if this function call is true, then we're going to add this item to our list. Results.push. And we add item. I can spell results. There we go. And otherwise, we won't. Okay, so we don't need to even say anything, right? And I have to name this. So the name of this function is myFilter, or filter array. There we go. So we have a function name, parameters defined. We pass in an array, pass in the test function. We iterate over the array. If the test function returns true when we pass in each item of the array, then that particular item is added to our results. So the final step then is to return the results. So that is the function, or the array of items that passed the test function test. Right? So here, let's say let berries 2 equal, and now instead of using, up here we did fruits.filter and then the test function, we have to do this different. We have to pass in our array and the test function. So we're going to say filter array. We pass in our array, which is fruits, and then our test function. All right, and then we will console.log those two things. So really this is berries and fruits, right? That's what we're testing for, even though the variable name is just berries. We're testing for berries or fruit in the name, in the element, right? And print it out. Oh, console.log berries 2. There we go. Okay, so a lot of this functionality, you know, we see it is the same values. So a lot of the functionality we can design for ourselves. It's just built into these programming languages, right? And sometimes it's good to try to mimic the tools that they provide. So we could provide this functionality ourselves, but it's kind of painful to do this sort of thing over and over, especially if you use it a lot, right? So these higher level programming languages include a whole lot of extra functionality that's just extremely common, right? You could code it yourself with the base parts of the programming language, but why, right? It's good to do it once or twice to understand how it works, but then once you understand how it works, it's nice to not have to define it in every single project, right? So that is an example of array filtration, right? So use fruits, like the array, whatever array you're talking about, .filter, and then pass in a test function. And remember, it's very common in JavaScript to see an argument to a function be defined directly where it's being injected, or where it's being used as an argument for that function, right? We saw that this, if I copy this and paste that in there, that's essentially exactly the same thing, and you'll see this all the time in JavaScript. Okay, so just that's something to be aware of when you see a curly bracket and then a parentheses. That generally means somebody was passing in a function as an argument, that sort of thing. Okay, but it's no different than defining the function first and then passing that identifier in as the argument. All right, so that's array.filter.